We're all supposed to be big on recycling these days, but it seems like the world's various military forces haven't gotten that memo. Whether through accident, war, forgetfulness, or something else, there's discarded military hardware all over the planet. The stories behind these abandoned military objects can often be fascinating, though, and so we're going to check a few out now. The residents of the Isle of Wight didn't have a great time during the Second World War. The tiny island is in the middle of the English Channel between England and France, making it an easy target for anyone who might be passing overhead dropping bombs. That's why Culver Battery was called upon for defensive duties during that conflict. But the military history of this installation goes back much further than that. The coastal artillery defenses were built during 1906 and saw their first action in the First World War as they defended a British fleet of torpedo boats. Beneath the visible portion of the structures, there were once toilets, kitchens, and living quarters, allowing troops to be stationed here for the short to medium term. Culver Battery became a weapons testing site after that war came to an end, but was called upon again when the Second World War broke out. This time, its job was to protect the nearby docks. The prospects of an invasion by sea from the Germans had dwindled by 1942, so the battery was stood down. It remained theoretically active for a further 14 years before being officially decommissioned, at which point the underground sections were sealed up and the guns were removed. Our next stop on this tour of military abandonment takes us to the icy reaches of Alaska, USA, where we're going to take a look at the Buckner building. There was once so much life within its walls that people used to joke that it was a whole indoor city. Now the building is lifeless. The walls are collapsing and there are at least 3 inches of pooled water on the lower floors. Unless someone steps in to save the building, which is in the city of Whittier, it will likely fall down of its own accord within the next decade. The Buckner building was built in 1949 as a self-contained military base, and its existence was top secret. That didn't mean that the officers and their families living there couldn't have fun, though. There was a bowling alley, a theater, a building-specific radio station, and even a bakery. Life inside Buckner was good for just over 15 years, but the military had already run out of reasons to justify keeping it open by the time the Big Alaska earthquake caused huge damage to it in 1964. As there is exposed asbestos all over the building and black mold on the walls, urban explorers are advised to give it a wide berth. Cold War paranoia led to a whole host of unlikely creations. You can see perfect proof of that in the shape of a so-called space gun in Barbados. To give it its full title, this is the Project HARP space gun, with the word HARP being an acronym for High Altitude Research Project. It was a collaborative endeavor between the military forces of the USA and Canada with the aim of building a gun so massive and powerful that it could launch objects into the upper atmosphere. It succeeded in that aim. After work started in 1961, the gun fired a test projectile an incredible 112 miles into the air during a 1963 test. That's a fact made all the more remarkable when you consider that this is little more than a 50 caliber cannon from a naval battleship that's been modified into a 100 caliber cannon. The end goal for the project was to launch satellites into orbit from the ground, and also potentially fire weapons across enormous distances. But in 1967, the American side of the project pulled funding after war broke out in Vietnam. They never came back to their work after the war ended, and so the cannon has become nothing more than a rusty curiosity surrounded by dense bushes. Of course, military history goes back much further than the 21st and 20th centuries. Here's a slice of military history from the year 540 BCE. During that year, history's first great naval battle took place close to Corsica. It's known as the Battle of Alalia, and it saw the Greek settlers of Alalia attacked by both the Etruscans and the Carthaginians. According to Herodotus, The Greek settlers managed to fend off the invaders and claim an unlikely victory, but it came at a great cost. Their ships and buildings were so badly damaged they had to abandon Eulalia and head south anyway, leaving behind all that they couldn't carry. Among the things they couldn't carry were their helmets, which were discovered by archaeologists in February 2022. This cluster of ancient helmets appears to have been deposited deliberately in a rectangular pit just outside an ancient temple. It's likely that the departing Greeks wanted to make a final offering to the gods before they left, either as thanks for the victory or in the hope that their outward journey would be blessed. The helmets will be cleaned up in a laboratory and then studied before being placed on display to the public. Artillery bunkers aren't especially beautiful things to look at. They're even uglier when they've been abandoned for a long time, and their concrete structures begin to crumble. That's why the Lefrenkulka bunkers in France are such a breath of fresh air. These artillery bunkers were created by the Nazis during the Second World War, but in more recent years, they've begun to attract artists from all over the world. The first few artists livened them up with graffiti, but some of the bunkers now have artificial wraps, shells, and mosaic panels decorating their exterior surfaces. The bunkers were added to the site after the Germans seized Fort de Dune during the Second World War and made it part of the Atlantic Wall. The French military regained control after the war ended, but moved out in the mid-1950s after declaring the facilities obsolete. They rotted away until the 1990s, which is when the first artists were allowed to come and demonstrate their skills here. Each bunker has a different theme. One of them is even covered in mirrors, which makes it a remarkable thing to look at, but a little difficult to deal with in direct sunlight. Everything we've looked at so far has been an abandoned military weapon or building. Let's look at something a little larger. How about a whole abandoned military town in Latvia? It's called Urban, and you'll find it in Ventspils County. Back in the days of the Soviet Union, the residents of this town were military officers and their families, who were billeted to the town to protect and work on a top-secret Soviet radar facility known only as STAR. As is the case with many former Soviet facilities of this kind, it was abandoned shortly after the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Troops and officers stayed on here for a while but packed their bags and left for good in 1993. The enormous radio telescope is still in use today and belongs to the Ventspils International Radio Astronomy Center, but there's nobody living in the former houses dotted around it. The village has an eerie tone and would make for an ideal location if somebody wanted to film a post-apocalyptic horror movie. In some cases, clothing and possessions belonging to the former soldiers are still visible through the windows of the houses, almost a full 30 years after they moved out. If you're going to host the Olympic Games, you need an Olympic village. Here's the one Adolf Hitler built for the Berlin Games of 1936. It was the first of its kind. Hitler wanted to show Germany's technical and architectural strength off to the world, and this is how he did it. The country has gone to such lengths to distance itself from the Nazis since the end of the war that many modern residents of Berlin don't even know this place exists, even though it's on their doorstep. The site is badly battered and decayed today, but its dormitories, swimming pools, communal dining areas, and training facilities would have been considered state-of-the-art in the 1930s. The 4,000 athletes who stayed here for the tournament would never have been so well provided for. Aesthetically, the village was styled after the appearance of a traditional rural town. The dictator loved the finished product and named it the Village of Peace. Even then, though, he tried to ban Jewish and non-white athletes from using it. The village was eventually seized by the Soviet Army at the end of the Second World War and used as a barracks until 1994, after which it's been abandoned. The ferocity of the Second World War made it necessary to build a lot of things that would never have been built during peacetime, and not all of those things could be repurposed after the war was over. That, in a nutshell, is the tale of Torpedonia in Gdynia, Poland, sitting off the coast in the Bay of Gdansk, Known to the Germans who built it as Torpedo Waffenplatz Hexengrund, this was a torpedo testing facility that was built in 1942 and abandoned by 1945. Back then, this part of the world belonged to the German state of West Prussia. The defeated Germans lost control of the region after the war ended, and Torpedonia was handed over to the Soviet Army to be used for military training. They didn't use it for long, and eventually stripped away all the machinery worth saving and left the shell of the buildings to rot. They destroyed the pier that linked the site to the mainland as they left, but that hasn't stopped many people from visiting it by boat in the years since. There's no security, so anyone can gain access, but the building is decrepit and could collapse any day. We're heading to Croatia now and visiting the city of Šibenik on the Adriatic coast. That's where we'll find the supposedly impenetrable structure known as the Fortress of St. Nicholas. We don't mean to disparage its reputation, but we don't think St. Nicholas Fortress is actually all that impenetrable. If it were, we wouldn't be able to show you so many great images of its interior taken by urban explorers. The arrow-shaped fortress was built by the Venetians during the 16th century as a safeguard against attacks by Turkish forces. The builders rendered the structure out of stone and brick, connected it to the mainland through a narrow walkway, and armed it with 32 cannons. Back when it was armed, it looked so intimidating that nobody even dared to try attacking it, and so it remained in service as an active deterrent for over 400 years until 1979, when the military finally decided it was obsolete. These days, anyone is welcome to approach it by boat and squeeze their way in through the narrow entrance. But it's probably a better idea to take the official tour and avoid the risk of injury. The next location on our list is in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it has served a few different purposes in the past. It's been both an observatory and a military fortress, but these days it's just a ruin. Back when it was used for stargazing purposes, it was called the Colina Kappa Astronomical Observatory. Long before that, it was an Austro-Hungarian fortress, offering an unobstructed view across the entire city of Sarajevo from the top of Mount Trebevic, and being used for military observation purposes during both the First and Second World Wars. The Orion Astronomical Society took possession of the building after the Second War came to an end, and by 1972, it was the most significant observatory in the whole country, full of state-of-the-art technology. It might still be working today were it not for the outbreak of the Bosnian War during the 1990s, which saw the building damaged by stray gunfire and shelling. It's been unoccupied ever since, leaving the nation without a single working observatory. There's a campaign group within the country trying to get it restored, but sadly they haven't made much progress thus far. Nicosia International Airport has almost everything that a thriving airport needs. It has departure lounges with plenty of seats. It has shops and hangars and offices. It even has planes on the runway. The only thing it doesn't have is any customers, and that's been the case since the 1970s. This was once the main airport in Cyprus, built as a military facility during the 1930s, but eventually expanded and opened up for civilian use. It might even still be thriving now were it not for a coup staged by Greek nationalists inside the country in 1974, the year the airport closed. The nationalists seized the airport and camped inside it to defend themselves from Turkish forces, and the whole area eventually became a demilitarized zone. That forced the airport to shut down, and it never reopened again. Officially, the land and anything that stands on it is controlled by the United Nations, and more than 40 years after the conflict, it's still a demilitarized zone. But there's never been any sign of the UN wanting to do anything to either fix up the airport or tear it down. It simply stands there, quietly crumbling. The Fushan tunnels in Qingdao, China, look somehow out of place on Mount Fu. Perhaps that has something to do with the fact that they're German. The backstory here is that Qingdao was settled as an outpost by German colonists at the end of the 19th century. That's why there's still a Bavarian quarter in the city today, and also explains why the German-style Tsingtao beer is brewed here. The colonists went to great lengths to protect their new home, and those lengths included building fortifications both underground and high in the mountains. They feared that the British fleet in Hong Kong would one day come and attack them, and so they needed somewhere to flee to in the event of such an emergency. The Fushan tunnels aren't just hiding places, though. They run between gun turrets and lookout points, each with a strategic purpose. The siege of Tsingtao eventually came anyway, and so the Germans left Qingdao in 1914, thinking they'd find peace at home. Sadly for them, most of them were instantly drafted into the First World War. The tunnels fell first into Japanese hands and then became China's, serving as an artillery depot during the Cultural Revolution of the 1970s, before eventually being abandoned in 1976. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!